Kia ora koutou and welcome to Friday afternoon's webinar session on media reform, modernising regulation and content funding arrangements for New Zealand. I will just start the way that we traditionally start meeting hui, the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, with our Ministry karakia. Tikina, tikina, atura, te putaki o ngā kōrero, e runga i te rangi Māori e, kia nākau titikaha, kia mau ki te hononga tangata, ka whakamoa kia tina, hui e, tai e. Thank you very much for coming along today to discuss the government's draft proposals for media reform in New Zealand. It's really good to see a lot of familiar names joining us on the chat today, and some of you are new, so you're very welcome. My name is Emily Fabling. I'm Deputy Secretary here at the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, Manatū Taonga. The Ministry is leading this media reform work for the government as we are responsible for media policy to the Minister for Media and Communications. We do have sign language interpreters for this session. Welcome, Rachel. And you can also turn on captioning. There are instructions in the Q&A tab at the top of your screen about how to do this. Today's session will be recorded. We had another session on Wednesday. This is to ensure that people who are unable to attend can still have access to the same information to support their engagement with proposals. We take people's privacy very seriously and will make sure that all collection, retention, and access of personal information is done responsibly and respectfully. All personal information that is shared at our sessions is held in accordance with the Privacy Act, the Official Information Act, and the Public Records Act. If you are using an AI recording assistant, our preference is that you turn that off now because we don't have permissions from all participants. For more information about how we keep information, please visit our website at mch.govt.nz/privacy. So today's session, the purpose of our session today is to introduce the media reform proposals and our consultation process. Some of you may be interested in all the proposals and some of you might be interested in only one or two. So today's session is going to go through each of the proposals and have questions at the end. We've set aside 1 hour for this session. So during this session, I will take you through the background to the proposals, the challenges we are trying to address, and how we decided on these 5 proposals, the aims of the media reform work, a summary of the proposals that we are consulting on, and information on the consultation process and how you can submit. At the end of the session, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So you will have about 20 minutes or so of me talking, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. Please enter these into the Q&A function at the top, on the top banner along the top of your screen, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible today, or take away and answer these online if it's not something that we can address immediately. So we'll see what we can do with the questions that come through to us today. At this stage, as set out in the document, the proposals are high level and the government has not decided whether to progress them. The purpose of this consultation is to hear your feedback on the proposals and how we could improve or change them to support the best outcomes for our sector and our audiences. So we're all aware that our media and screen sectors are facing multiple and complex challenges. Technological advancements and increasing globalisation have brought new options, predominantly global content platforms, into the New Zealand market. Audiences now have significantly more choice around where and how they consume media content and the types of content they consume. Less local content is being commissioned, and what is being produced is no longer reaching all local audiences on all platforms. In a time with unprecedented access to global content, it is vital we support our local content. Without change, New Zealanders will increasingly struggle to discover local content, missing out on the important cultural and societal benefits that seeing and hearing our stories and voices brings. This will also negatively impact the capability and workforce of the local media and production sectors. The way we consume media, information, news, entertainment has changed greatly since the Broadcasting Act 1989 and the New Zealand Film Commission Act 1978 were enacted. The current legislation also creates an unequal playing field for local media, as regulatory aspects only apply to certain content providers. For example, the Broadcasting Standards regime only covers linear TV and radio, and not other content providers like streaming platforms. This makes the challenges for New Zealand broadcasters to remain sustainable and profitable harder when competing with less regulated competitors. So let's talk now about where these proposals came from. The 5 proposals that are set out in our discussion document have been developed from discussions with those of you working in the media sector, including local broadcasters and content producers, about the issues you face. So a big thank you from me for all the engagement we've already had so far. Looking at international examples of reform, so many countries, including Australia and Canada, are modernising media legislation to introduce new mechanisms to protect and promote local stories, creators, and content production sectors, and local TV broadcasters in the current media landscape. We've also drawn on feedback from previous engagements, including the engagement on strong public media, that was the Aotearoa New Zealand public media proposal, through our experience with COVID funding, and the screen sector review that was done a couple of years ago on the screen production grant, now rebate. We've also reviewed academic and media reports from here and overseas on suggestions of how to help the media sector and what governments can do in support. There are 3 overarching aims of the media reforms. The first is to create a modern and fit-for-purpose regulatory and funding environment. The second is to support a healthy and sustainable media that can compete alongside international media. And the third is to support New Zealand's content production sector to deliver authentic local content for New Zealand audiences. So there are some rules, scope, or parameters in which the team is working in developing these proposals. Firstly, the proposals do not include options involving new or ongoing government spending. This recognises the government's priority of reducing Crown debt. Second, in terms of existing legislation, the proposals only address legislation that is administered by the Ministry for Culture and Heritage. Other matters, which are the responsibility of other agencies and ministers, are out of scope. These include the Internal Affairs portfolio, responsible for social media, broader content regulation, and the Films, Videos and Publications Classification Act of 1993. Also includes as out of scope issues pertaining to Māori development and the justice portfolios, which includes parts of the Broadcasting Act governing Te Māngai Pāho and electoral broadcasting. New Zealand also has obligations under international trade law to treat international content providers and creators no less favourably than domestic content providers. Regulatory support for New Zealand media providers or audiovisual content creators creates some risk of inconsistency with New Zealand's international trade obligations, which does need to be considered against the benefits of the proposals. This work on media reforms also complements other initiatives underway to address specific issues in the sector, such as the Broadcasting Repeal of Advertising Restrictions Amendment Bill, that's Sunday advertising, currently with Select Committee, and the Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill. Draft Proposal 1. This is about ensuring accessibility of local media platforms. So bearing in mind those parameters that I talked about before, we've developed 5 proposals to achieve these aims. The first proposal is to require TV manufacturers to ensure local free-to-air TV apps can be easily found by audiences on smart TVs. For example, requirements could include pre-installation and visibility on the home screen of local apps such as TVNZ Plus, Freeview, or Māori Plus. Research has shown that if a local app is not easily accessible, audiences are unlikely to go out of their way to find them. Ensuring a basic level of prominence will support New Zealanders to engage with local providers and the greater share of local news and content that they host. Draft Proposal 2, increasing investment into and the discoverability of local content. So this proposal would require streaming platforms and TV broadcasters to invest in local content and implement measures to ensure that it's easier to find on their platforms. Global streaming platforms such as Netflix and Disney are popular with audiences, but do little to contribute to local content production and engagement. This proposal will help the sustainability of the sector through increased private investment. Local content reaches audiences by increasing the volume and visibility of local content on global streaming platforms. As I mentioned before, due to international trade obligations, the requirements would need to apply to all content providers. However, it is likely that New Zealand broadcasters and platforms would meet these obligations on current investment levels. Of course, you can see in the document that we did consider other options. Other options that we considered included a levy, which would lead to greater sector investment in local content production, but would not necessarily increase access to it, as the content supported by a levy may not appear on streaming platforms. Some countries, however, have both a levy and an investment obligation. We really look forward to hearing your submissions on that proposal. Proposal 3. This is about increasing captioning and audio description. This proposal would create legislative obligations on TV broadcasters and streaming platforms to provide more captioning and audio description of content. This will provide more equitable access to local content for deaf and blind New Zealanders. It will also provide greater access for speakers of other languages and others that increasingly use this technology to watch content without sound. This proposal will also assist New Zealand to meet our obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to ensure access to information. Proposal 4, almost there. Proposal 4, modernising professional media regulation. This proposal would create a modern, technology-neutral regime to cover all professional media, not just broadcasters. This would include streaming platforms and online providers, but not social media and other platforms that host non-curated, user-generated content. The regulator would perform most of the functions the current Broadcasting Standards Authority has now in respect of this wider scope. However, its role in complaints resolution would be as a backstop. Most complaints that are not resolved by the media organisation itself would be dealt with by industry self-regulatory bodies like the Media Council. This proposal aims to increase the consistency and durability of regulation across the range of professional media that New Zealanders engage with, and leverage industry self-regulation to allow a more system-level focus for the proposed regulator. Lastly, Proposal 5, Streamlining Crown Content Funders. This proposal would consolidate the Film Commission and New Zealand On Air into one entity that distributes funds for content. Our initial analysis suggests that this would improve efficiency and cohesion and enable more strategic funding outcomes, including by pooling resources and focusing industry development efforts. The entity would bring together functions and powers of both entities through modernised and streamlined governing legislation. As most of you on this call will know, there is a range of material that provides further information on our work, and you can find this on our website. This includes the full discussion document for your feedback, as well as some summary material. There are also 3 regulatory impact statements, or RISs. The RIS supporting local audiovisual content production and accessibility includes analysis on the first 3 proposals. And then you'll see there are 2 separate RISs listed there. You will also find information in a number of accessible formats, including HTML, Word, and PDF versions, recorded videos of these information sessions, and the presentations from workshops that include the New Zealand Sign Language translation and captioning will also be available on the Ministry's website. Aside from making a submission, and please do make a submission, there are a couple of other ways you can engage with us on these proposals during the consultation period. Workshops will be held focusing on each of the proposals. The workshops will involve more in-depth discussion, probably more of a 2-way engagement on each of the proposals, and enable attendees to share their views. You will also be able to ask more detailed questions on the proposals. Places are limited for these workshops, so please register on the Ministry's website if you'd like to attend any of these workshops. And of course, if none of those options work for you and you have a question about the consultation process or the document, please email mediaandscreen@mch.govt.nz. So, like I said, there are a number of ways you can make a submission. You can email us, you can fill out an online survey, or you can post us a submission at the address there on screen. Submissions close on Sunday, the 23rd of March. And again, you might be interested in all 5 of the proposals, a couple of the proposals, or you might have a proposal of your own. So please submit on any or all of the proposals. We look forward to hearing from you. So now, when I have a sip of water, I'm happy to take any questions. We will be taking those through the Q&A section on the top banner across your screen. As I mentioned earlier, we'll try and answer as many as we can today. We will try and answer as slowly as possible so that Rachel can keep up. And we will have some frequently asked questions on our website soon, picking up on the questions that you've raised today or that we aren't able to cover. But again, if you have any other questions, please email us on mediaandscreen@mch.govt.nz. Okay. I am looking at the first question, which is about the levies and international investment obligations. So the question is, in respect to the possible models of levies on commercial revenue streams to support public media and local content, why is it assumed that this is incompatible with some form of prominence or must carry obligation? Thank you for that question. I think we're not ruling one or the other out. Our initial analysis has shown that investment obligations would achieve the dual objectives of increasing investment in local content and ensuring that streamers play a role in making that content available. But as I said in the presentation earlier, some countries have both levies and investment obligations. Some have gone with levies, others have gone with investment obligations. So we're really looking forward to hearing from submitters on what they think would work best in New Zealand's context. So hopefully that answers that question. Thank you for putting that forward. We've got another question here on the captioning and audio description. Thank you for your question. What content would be required to provide captioning and audio description? So the proposal would apply to professional audiovisual media providers operating in New Zealand. That's TV channels, streaming platforms, and as I mentioned previously, excluding those that mainly host non-curated or user-generated content. That's your YouTubes, TikToks, etc. So at this stage, it's high level. The proposal does not specify the types of content that should be captioned or audio descriptioned, but the rules could set out what types of content could be prioritised, like, for example, emergency messaging or children's content or Te Reo Māori content in New Zealand. We're really interested in hearing feedback on the options, possibilities, or maybe barriers that get in the way that we haven't thought of. So please do send that through. I hope that's helped with a little bit more explanation of that one.
Kia ora, Emily. I might just jump in. Kia ora koutou. My name's Elisa Daly-Sadgrove. I work with Emily at Manatūtanga, the Ministry of Culture and Heritage. I can see there's a question that's coming through now, which, sorry, apologies for the slight delay in our tech system, but I might just jump in if that's all right with you, Emily. So the question reads, is there a reason why cinema and or exhibition is not mentioned in this review, other than saying it is in decline? Is this out of scope? And if so, why? This is one of the key ways in which New Zealand films are experienced, both via festivals and through wider distribution. It's a really great question, thank you. I think, you know, there'll be a range of views about the scope of our work in this media reform package. We are really keen to hear if you think we've missed things that should be prioritised in terms of legislative reform, or even wider non-legislative things that you think should be happening in the regulatory space. So I think our key focus has been the areas that we've been hearing from our sectors that we engage with fairly regularly as priorities to address in that legislative space. But please do let us know if you see either gaps in the proposals or areas where you think the proposals could be added to or changed or however you see best improved to deal with other issues that you think are key for our sectors.
Thanks, Elisa. And I think building on that, there's another question that's just come through around what the merged entity's primary purpose would be. And I assume that's relating to Proposal 5, which is looking at bringing together the Film Commission, which does focus on cinema or film, as per the previous question, and New Zealand On Air, which funds other content, including music and non-screened content. So again, this is a high-level proposal, so the entity's primary purpose or purposes would depend on the scope of its functions. We would expect it to bring together current focuses on reflecting New Zealand, so that's including the integral place of tangata whenua, te reo and tikanga Māori and delivering for local audiences. But there's also the role of increasing the reach and impact of funded content domestically and internationally. That tends to fall more in the premises of the current Film Commission than New Zealand On Air, and supporting industry development. So the Film Commission and New Zealand On Air do have different but complementary purposes at the moment, and there's also the potential duplication with the way audiences consume content. So we'd be really interested in hearing people's views on where the emphasis should lie, whether a consolidation is a good idea or not, or whether there's other options as well. So again, thank you. That was a good little build on the previous question as well. Excellent. We just have a little pause. If you've got burning questions, please do put them in the chat. We're happy to answer them, even if the answer is I don't know right now. Please do put any questions in the chat for us. I'm happy to try and answer them to the best of my ability.
I might jump in again, and I'll just read out a question that I think again is sort of in the machine of coming through to published questions. It's a long question, so I'll just read it out first. In the RIS Streamlining Content Funders, it states the analysis supporting structural consolidation weights long-term impacts higher than short-term, recognising the likely significant costs of transition. As well as these costs, risks around industry disruption and uncertainty would need to be carefully managed and mitigated. Can you talk to what the long-term impacts are that give them more importance than the disruption and uncertainty? So again, another really great thorny little question there. I think what I'd flag to start with is that those factors, the long-term and short-term, when we're talking about short-term, that industry disruption and uncertainty, we will definitely be keen to hear feedback on whether that's a factor that you as submitters see as something that's really important, and how we can mitigate any impacts of around those, how we can mitigate those impacts, I should say. But in terms of us weighting longer term impacts higher than those shorter term impacts, that's essentially because when we go back to the aims of our proposals to modernise and support durable regulation, we inherently would look to weight long-term effects higher than short-term. You're really welcome to tell us if you think that's the wrong weighting. And obviously, when the industry is in the state of flux and challenge that we know everyone's facing now, we could understand that perspective. So please do tell us about your thoughts on that matter, and let us know what extra information we should be weighing up if you think there's some gaps there.
And I'll ping off that too, Lisa. Thank you. It's also, don't forget, also short-term and long-term impacts on the government's balance sheet. So there might be short-term costs to structural change of the Crown entities, the Film Commission and New Zealand On Air, but potentially longer-term gains for government expenditure in this space with the size of the organisation or the different governance models that you might have. So there's absolutely both short-term benefits and long-term benefits, but also short-term costs and long-term costs that we'd be really keen on hearing the sector's views on, so that we can give our best advice to the government when they're making their final decisions. There's a question here, thank you for responding to my encouragement to ask more questions. There's a question here around, can you explain a bit better how the international obligations impact what we can do in New Zealand. I'll have first go at that, but again, I might pass to Elisa if she wants to add anything. So New Zealand's international trade commitments, and these include everything from our closer economic relations agreement with Australia through to more recent UK and EU FTAs, the China Free Trade Agreement and others. So those trade commitments include obligations to treat foreign suppliers of goods and services no less favourably than local providers. So at the time that those obligations were negotiated, over many decades now, countries negotiated different exceptions or carve-outs to that rule, the rule of no less favourable. So each country's obligations can differ in scope. In New Zealand's case, we have a few narrow exceptions relating to audiovisual services. And so for this reason, we can't compare our obligations in free trade agreements to those of other countries. They are New Zealand specific and quite narrowly restricted to audiovisual services. On the world stage, New Zealand takes its international obligations very seriously. Those obligations will remain at the forefront of decision making about any options to be progressed by government as a result of this consultation. Elisa, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's probably, yeah, good description of where we're at. They are obviously a complicated area, and we work closely with our colleagues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade on that. If you've got really detailed questions about those, please do feel free to email them through, and we can do our best to get you some fulsome answers.
Awesome. There's another question here. It's a kind of a scope question. It relates, I imagine, probably to Proposal 5. Again, the consolidation of Crown entities that fund content. While you mentioned that Te Māngai Pāho is out of scope, there is clear intersection with New Zealand On Air and the New Zealand Film Commission. So how are you considering these areas where the current agencies collaborate? So just a little bit of a backgrounder. Te Māngai Pāho is specifically mandated to promote Te Reo Māori and Tikanga Māori through funding for Māori language programming. It sits alongside other Māori language entities within the Māori development portfolio. Our colleagues at Te Puni Kōkiri are considering ways to improve collaboration and outcomes across those Māori language entities. And so the request from Te Puni Kōkiri, and when the proposals went through Cabinet, was that at this stage, Te Māngai Pāho and those sections of the Broadcasting Act 1989 are considered out of scope. That is not to say that Te Māngai Pāho, New Zealand On Air and the Film Commission, or a consolidated entity, if that's what comes to be, wouldn't be working closely together. But there is a separate process going on in another part of government that we're keeping close to, but is considered out of scope for these proposals. If you have any suggestions or submissions on that, and a really strong view on that something should be in rather than out, please let us know, and it's then that we can take that to our ministerial masters and have a discussion.
I think I'd just add to that, Emily, that we are working closely with our colleagues at Te Puni Kōkiri to make sure that we're aligned where appropriate and complementary in terms of the work that we're progressing. But we know that there is some strong collaboration that happens across the three entities now, and I think, as Emily indicated, we'd expect that to continue, and we'd be looking to make sure the settings allow that collaboration to continue, so that we get the best outcomes across the board.
Thank you. Questions coming through still. So we've got one here about the gaming platform Steam, whether we see gaming platforms like Steam falling in the definition of audio-visual media providers, and that's in relation to proposal 2. I'll hand to Elisa on that one.
Thank you, Emily. So yeah, we probably at this stage, we weren't envisioning that gaming platforms and video games and that sort of thing are considered within the scope of that proposal 2, or really the proposals in general in terms of what we're looking at with media reform. We know that there are crossovers with the television and film and screen sectors, and that's a sort of a wider lens on our problem definition around some of our other proposals in relation to media convergence. So at the moment, proposal 2 is really around the core, I suppose the classic sort of the Netflixes and so forth, the video, not gaming, video content. But if you do think that it's something that should expand, that proposal is something that should expand to cover gaming or other types of audiovisual platforms, and we recognise that gaming is obviously falls within that audiovisual category, please do let us know in the submissions and tell us what we need to keep top of mind as we're progressing these proposals, if that's what the government decides to do.
Yeah, one of the reasons that they are more easily, if you like, considered out of scope was also that the grounding legislation for these changes is the Broadcasting Act 1989, and for better or worse, from a piece of legislation from 1989 doesn't really envisage gaming or platforms like Steam. So we kind of hindered a little bit by the legislative base in which we're starting these proposals from. The other thing I'd suggest is that we did cover this a little bit in the Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage's consultation on the Amplified Draft Creative and Cultural Strategy. That so happens to be the same Minister Paul Goldsmith. So there is quite a lot of crossover between what the government envisages for the creative industries, which absolutely and definitely includes gaming, and these media screen proposals. So again, if we haven't quite got the balance right, or you think that the scope should be broadened in one area, please do let us know, because it's really helpful for us when we're then engaging with the decision makers across the road in the Beehive. We can talk a little bit more informedly about those kinds of scope issues. Another question, this is a procedural question, so really good, just doesn't matter what sort of questions they are, keep them coming in. Question is around, how do you participate in the workshops? I note they are next week. Yes, they are. Registrations are online. If you go to mch.govt.nz, you should be on the homepage there. It should be really easy to find. You should be able to click on a link and register for those workshops. If you are struggling with that or have difficulties with finding those links, then please just email us directly at media@nch.govt.nz. Elisa.
One thing I'll just add, and I recognise this is maybe not ideal for those of you who are hearing first about these sessions now, but we are, because one of our first session is running on Monday, the registration for that session, which is considering the proposal to require investment into local content and discoverability requirements. The registration for that session on Monday closes today at 4. So please do get in there quick if you're keen to attend that session.
And obviously, we will, if there is overwhelming demand, we will try and find a way both to put the workshops up online, but also if there's a possibility that we could do another one, if we're really overwhelmed, then we will do our very best to do so. We've got a window for this consultation, and we'll do our best to pack as much into that as we possibly can. So if you're not able to register, if you can't find where to register, just email us, and someone will be back to you as quickly as possible. Another question, which is a really interesting one, thank you. And we got a similar question in our online webinar on Wednesday. We didn't see much in the doc about music, although New Zealand On Air supports music as well as film. So where do you see the music industry in connection with these proposals? Luckily, I just referenced Amplify, the government's draft creative and cultural strategy. So generally speaking, music has been considered as a part of Amplify, and Amplify submissions happened at the end of last year, and we're currently in submissions analysis for that. That's a draft national strategy that outlines how the government will prioritise support for our creative and cultural sectors to 2030. In terms of this proposal and the proposal around streamlining and consolidating the funding entities, we've identified that there might be opportunities to clarify roles between the range of entities that support different elements of music creation. As a ministry, we also pass through funding to Creative New Zealand, who fund elements of music in New Zealand. And we also fund the New Zealand Music Commission, which has other funding elements for live and recorded music production in terms of offshore capacity. So there is quite a number of functions and services and operating models for music. And while it is captured in the media reform package to an extent because of New Zealand On Air's current role, it's something that we would need to consider alongside any decisions in this space. Elisa, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think that's a really good summary. I think the only thing I would add just to the end of that is when we talk about the consolidating the two entities, we have said that the remit of that proposed entity, and again open to feedback on this, would be for media content in any form. So that would include music still. So we would be looking in terms of how the proposal is framed now to bring that function that New Zealand On Air currently performs into this consolidated entity as well. So that opportunity that we've identified around whether there might be some further work to kind of rejig how the responsibilities of multiple entities are supporting music at the moment. That's something that we're not necessarily considering right at this moment, but we are really keen to hear feedback if you think that there are some things we should be doing either in legislation or if this proposal progresses in an operational kind of organisation, that kind of thing. So tell us what you think, really, that's all I'd add.
Thanks, Elisa. There is another question, and this is around a definition of local content. So can you please expand more on what the further work involved with determining a definition of local content will entail? So as I said at the outset, the discussion document is still high level. You can see a bit more detail in the regulatory impact statements. But further policy work is required and planned on the definition of local content. Obviously, we welcome your feedback. Local, applying to New Zealand, content, we just had a question on is music in or out? So there are a range of views that we already know about what we mean by local content, and we're really keen to hear from you. Elisa, I'll pass to you for more detail.
Thank you. Again, maybe not necessarily detail, but just some extra context, a bit of context. I think one thing that we know from previous consultation that we've done with, particularly with the screen industry, is that it's really important for settings around investment into particular types of content to be really clear about what we mean. So a lot of our policy work will be focused on ensuring that clarity with definitions that we set. At the same time, we want to ensure flexibility because we don't want to be overly or unnecessarily constraining our creative sectors about the types of content that we are looking at bringing that investment into. So there's a balance to be had between flexibility and certainty. really keen to hear more about what you think should and shouldn't be in there.
We absolutely don't want to be talking about the Broadcasting Act 2026 like in 20, 30 years' time, like we are about the Broadcasting Act 1989. That flexibility and ability to move with what's really going on is really important to us in developing new and improved regulation. There's a question now on TVNZ, the Crown-owned company. There doesn't seem to be an inclusion of TVNZ in the way they work and operate in this process. Can you give some context why this Crown entity company is not included currently in this consultation at this stage? There's a short answer to that, which I'll try and start with. So these proposals focus on how our Crown content funders operate and what efficiencies we can find. So as a state broadcaster, TVNZ does not distribute funding for content, so that is not in scope. That's the short answer. TVNZ has its own legislation and purpose and tends to be the recipient of funding where it is a platform. But the focus of Proposal 5 is around the Crown content funders, the Film Commission and New Zealand On Air. A follow-up question, which is back to our international trade obligations. Next time I'll have to have someone from MFAT sitting alongside me for these questions. My understanding, the question is, my understanding is that the New Zealand Film Commission and Creative New Zealand were exempted from WTO rules. That's the World Trade Organization. When I was working at MCH, hello, potentially this means the New Zealand Film Commission legislation, which has a very inclusive description of film with tweaking, could be fit for purpose. Just something to check. Okay, so that's kind of a question and kind of a helpful handy hint. I'll hand over to Elisa to answer that comment.
Thanks, Emily. Don't know if that's a little bit of a hospital pass, that one. So I think while I am, as Emily sort of pointed out at the start, we're not the detailed experts on our WTO commitments. My understanding, and please take this with a grain of salt, and we can come back to you if you're interested in further, more guaranteed detail, is that there's one of our carve-outs, and I think Emily mentioned these carve-outs when we were going through the presentation, relates to the Film Commission's support of New Zealand films. You're right that I think your implication here is that the Film Commission obviously does a little bit more than just support New Zealand films. So there's a question about kind of how modernised that particular part is. I wouldn't be able to comment on the prospect of tweaking obligations that's in our international space, but we can definitely take that comment and flag with our colleagues for their awareness. And please do, if there's something more specific that you were getting at, please let us know. Just flick an email to us and we can come back to you offline.
Okay, there is a detailed question on some of the explanation in one of our regulatory impact statements. It's quoting from our regulatory impact statement, and I'll read that now. Both entities, that's New Zealand On Air and the Film Commission, invest most of their operating budgets on contestable funding for the production of content across an overlapping range of content types and formats. Are we able to clarify what the overlapping range of content types and formats is? I think we've touched on this in a couple of previous questions. So the main overlaps between the Film Commission and New Zealand On Air are around screen content and screen industry development. So for us, in our initial analysis, that has indicated that there may be efficiencies in bringing what currently sits in two standalone Crown entities together as well as the opportunity to make sure funding is distributed cohesively and strategically, meeting the purpose of a potentially newly combined entity.
And I think that a more contextual part of this answer maybe is also to think about the fact that while we see that overlap primarily in the screen space, we know that there are, as I mentioned earlier, that media convergence more generally in terms of both production of media and consumption of media is a broader sort of theme of modernisation. So there's some, that goes back to that durability of regulation question as well.
Is more a follow-up question on local content coming through. Is local content investment requirement on streamers and broadcasters intended to be complementary to existing government funding, or could it replace a portion of government funding? So I'll say at the outset, it is intended to be complementary, but also the document also states that no funding changes are proposed as part of this media reform policy package. Funding discussions and funding decisions happen outside of this process. There's another question in relation to music, and this is from, I hope you don't mind me naming you, the organisation Recorded Music New Zealand represents 4,000 members who would generally expect us to make submissions to government on their behalf. Will MCH take that into account when considering our submission, and or should we encourage individual members to make their own submissions? The short answer is yes. MCH will of course consider that. Again, we've had recent experience with the consultation on Amplify, the creative and cultural strategy. So we had submissions on that from large organisations, small organisations, medium and small sized businesses, sole proprietors, individual artists, practitioners, and we don't necessarily wait on the basis of whether it's come from an organisation or an individual. So my suggestion to you at Recorded Music New Zealand is absolutely make a submission on behalf of your organisation, but we will obviously take submissions from individuals who have a similar view or may have something individual that they want to share with us. So all and every submission is encouraged. We're back to proposal 5 in terms of the consolidation proposal. Would the design of the new merged agency consider who would undertake the roles traditionally played by commissioning platforms in terms of editorial, financial and compliance oversight? I'm going to hand that one on to Elisa, and then I might be your second after you've given the original answer.
Yeah, so thank you. I think we know that there are differences in the way that NZ On Air and the Film Commission perform those roles in relation to the relationship with the commissioning platform. So I don't necessarily think we'd be looking to change the way that those entities are doing it currently. Obviously, there's a question that we'll need to address should this proposal progress into detailed design. And again, that's subject to decisions to be taken after submissions close. In terms of how we merge those entities and their operational practices and how they work with commissioning platforms as well as the producers of content. So I think probably the ultimate answer is it depends. Tell us what you think. If you think there need to be things in legislation that set up how those relationships work. But I think, yeah, we'd still certainly see a role for commissioning platforms as they play now. So we're not looking at taking over all commissioning. I'm hoping that answers the primary part of the question.
And again, I'm not quite sure if the question was focused on the word editorial and a suggestion that a Crown entity was going to take over editorial decision making, then that's not the intention. But I encourage that person, or if you have similar questions, send those through to our media and screen email address, and we'll try and come back to you directly if we haven't quite understood where that question is coming from. So we've probably got time for one or two more questions. So we've got a question again on the proposed new consolidated entity. Is there more detail on the scope of suggested new platform neutral media regulator? This is in relation to the regulator as opposed to the consolidated content funder. So the scope of the new regulator is proposed to be expanded from the Broadcasting Standards Authority, which is grounded in broadcasting from the 1980s and 90s, the linear TV and radio platforms. It's proposed to be expanded to include professional media platforms operating in New Zealand. This would include the global streaming platforms. Further work is required to determine that precise scope, as we've already talked about, but the interim RIS, the regulatory impact statement, will give you more detail on that proposal. Did you want to add to that, Elisa?
Yeah, sure. So that expanded to professional media, we do recognise that that's slightly vague at this point, and that's actually a little bit deliberate. So we've provided in the discussion document a working definition around what could count as professional media. We're really keen to hear your feedback on whether that's the right definition to be working with, if you think it covers the right media organisations. So please do engage with what we've popped in that discussion document and let us know. Just to clarify, there's a scope question and then there's a function question, and so there are some other questions related to the kind of the specific roles of a regulator, that role that's currently performed by the BSA. We've treated those slightly separately, obviously related, but separate to the scope question in terms of how we've presented that. So really keen for feedback on the role of the regulator as well.
Thanks, Elisa. And one last question, which is on the role of Radio New Zealand, RNZ. The question is that RNZ also commissions content. Where do platforms who commission sit in this consultation? So the process or the proposals in our discussion document focus on how our Crown content funders operate and what efficiencies we can find. So RNZ commissions but does not distribute funding, Crown funding into our sector. So at this stage that RNZ is not in scope of the media reform proposals.
And maybe just to clarify, so they're not in scope of the proposal, the specific proposal around entities.
Right.
But they will, we do certainly see some impacts on TVNZ and RNZ as have been raised in these questions in relation to some of the other proposals in particular. I mean, obviously there'll be flow-on effects for most of the sector, given our aims of supporting that sector. So let us know where you see those impacts as well.
So thank you everybody for what was a really lively question and answer session. This takes us to the end of our time together on this beautiful Friday afternoon. Just a huge thank you from me, Emily here at MCH, and our wider small but hardworking media and screen policy team for attending today's session. We look forward to engaging with you over the coming weeks and receiving lots and lots and lots of well-written submissions. We really do look forward to receiving those, and they will help us with our work immensely and help us give our best possible advice to the government, who in the end will make our final decisions on what proceeds. I'm just going to close us in our ministry karakia, as is usual, to end hui. So, and I look forward to hearing from you directly or through media and screen at mch.govt.nz in due course. Unihia, atura, te pūtaki o ngā kōrero, kia wātia te hinangaro, kia nākau te tikaha tonu, kia mau tonu ki te hononga tangata, whakaerie e rongo kia paitara āwhare, ka whakamaua kia tīna, kui e, tai ki e.